German POWs put on over 50 pounds in American camps during World War II. But this isn't a story about charity. It's about a weapon so powerful it turned our enemies into living proof of American supremacy. Picture this: a skeletal German. Soldier Karl Weiss, weighing barely 140 pounds, captured in the muddy hedgerows of Normandy. He's survived on stale bread and ersatz coffee for months. Then he's shipped to a POW camp in Texas, where something impossible happens. He sits down to bacon, eggs, white bread, and real coffee, more food than he's seen in years. While his family back in Germany queues for turnips, he's gaining weight behind barbed wire. This wasn't accident, it was strategy. America was feeding its enemies better than their own country ever did. But why? What happens when abundance becomes warfare? And how did a simple meal become the most devastating psychological weapon of the entire war? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The summer of 1944 changed everything, though few understood it at the time. In American prisoner of war camps scattered across Texas, Kansas, and Nebraska, something extraordinary was happening. German soldiers, captured skeletal and hollow-eyed from the battlefields of Europe, were transforming. Month by month, pound by pound, they were becoming living monuments to American industrial might. By war's end, the average German POW had gained over 50 pounds in American custody, not through charity, but through the systematic application of abundance as warfare. This was victory measured not in bullets fired, but in calories consumed. Every ounce gained by a captured enemy soldier represented a defeat for the Reich that no propaganda could overcome. The story of how America fed its prisoners better than Germany fed its own people reveals the true weapon that won the war, the unstoppable force of democratic prosperity. The Normandy hedgerows dripped with June mist as Oberfeldwebel Karl Weiss broke off a chunk of black bread, each bite calculated to last. His Wehrmacht ration tin contained the day's survival, 1,200 calories if he was fortunate, often less. The bread was more sawdust than wheat, the ersatz coffee bitter with chicory, and the thin margarine barely covered his fingertip. Weiss's hands trembled, not from fear of the approaching Americans, but from months of systematic starvation. The Reich promised victory while delivering hunger. His uniform hung loose on a frame that had shed 30 pounds since spring. Letters from his wife in Leipzig painted the same picture: endless queues for turnips, ration cards that promised nothing, children growing thin despite their mother's efforts. Across the hedgerow, American voices carried on the wind, along with smells that made his stomach clench: real coffee, frying bacon, cigarette smoke mixing with the aroma of food cooked in abundance. The contrast was stark. While German supply lines crumbled under Allied bombing, American logistics delivered feast to the front. The irony wasn't lost on Weiss. The Wehrmacht had conquered half of Europe, yet its soldiers fought on empty stomachs. Meanwhile, the enemy ate field rations designed for 4,000 calories daily, nearly triple what he survived on. When the brief firefight ended and American MPs searched his kit, they found only moldy bread heels and empty tins. As Weiss marched toward the collection point, his mind wandered to childhood meals in peacetime: his grandmother's strudel, Sunday roasts, milk with every meal. Those memories seemed from another world, another life, when abundance was normal rather than impossible. The American sergeant processing prisoners looked well-fed, his uniform clean and properly fitted. His eyes showed something Weiss couldn't. Immediately placed, not hatred or anger, but a kind of professional efficiency backed by inexhaustible resources. This was an army that never worried about its next meal. Standing in line with dozens of other captured Germans, Weiss noticed they all shared the same gaunt appearance, the same hollow cheeks and prominent bones. They were scarecrows in field, gray testimony to a regime that had promised everything while delivering starvation. The truck that would carry them to the coast bore Kansas license plates. Kansas, where wheat fields stretched beyond the horizon, where grain elevators rose like cathedrals to plenty. Weiss had studied American agriculture in school. He knew the numbers that made German farmers weep with envy. Sergeant Jack Mallory grew up counting corn rows in Nebraska, where John Deere tractors had replaced mules and hybrid seeds produced harvests that amazed visiting Europeans. His family survived the Dust Bowl eating beans and bread. But by 1943, mechanization had transformed those same fields into engines of war production. When Jack received orders for guard duty at a Texas POW camp, he expected routine work. Nothing prepared him for the sight of German prisoners eating steaks while his mother still rationed sugar back home. The irony cut deep. Captured enemies dined on beef while American civilians made do with less. The Geneva Convention mandated equal rations for prisoners and American troops, but the scale shocked him. Quartermaster Corps reports showed 17 million pounds of food delivered daily to camps worldwide. The numbers seemed impossible until he watched freight trains arrive, refrigerated cars from Wisconsin dairies, cattle cars from Kansas ranches, grain hoppers from Iowa farms. Jack's job was simple: watch the wire, count heads, maintain order. But he found himself studying the prisoners instead, particularly how they changed. Hollow-cheeked scarecrows became round-faced men within weeks. Uniforms that had hung loose began straining at the seams. The camp kitchen received more food than many Nebraska towns. Anna Ramirez, the head cook, stirred vats of beef stew that could feed hundreds. Cans arrived faster than they could be opened, stamped with names from across America's heartland, packed in Wisconsin, from the people of Kansas, Nebraska Beef Company. Jack's agricultural background helped him appreciate the scale. A single Iowa corn harvest could sustain multiple divisions for months. American farms produced not just surplus, but abundance beyond calculation. While German farmers struggled with draft horses and hand tools, American agriculture ran on gasoline and steel. The prisoners' transformation fascinated him. They approached meals with reverence, eating slowly, savoring flavors they hadn't tasted in years. Some wept at their first taste of fresh milk. Others stared at portions too large to finish, unable to comprehend such waste was possible. Letters from home described different realities. His mother canned vegetables from their victory garden, stretched meat with breadcrumbs, saved bacon grease like liquid gold. Meanwhile, POWs left food on their plates, a sight that both angered and amazed him. But Jack understood the larger picture. America's strength wasn't just military, it was productive. Every calorie fed to prisoners demonstrated capacity that dwarfed Axis imagination. This wasn't charity, it was warfare by other means. The contrast became his obsession. German guards at American POW camps in occupied Europe reported their own rations barely exceeded prisoner levels. Here, abundance flowed like water. Anna Ramirez wiped steam from her forehead as she stirred industrial-sized vats of beef stew. 6 months ago, she had cooked for her family of 5. Now she fed hundreds of German prisoners daily, using ladles that could serve a dozen bowls with each scoop. The kitchen operated like a factory. Beef arrived in frozen blocks, stamped with Wisconsin processing dates. Flour sacks bore Kansas Milling Company logos. Vegetables came from California farms, milk powder from dairy cooperatives across the Midwest. The abundance overwhelmed her. Storage, rooms stacked floor to ceiling with supplies. Anna noticed changes in the prisoners that amazed her. Men who had arrived skeletal and hollow-eyed began filling out within weeks. Cheekbones disappeared beneath healthy flesh. Uniforms that had hung like tent canvas grew tight across expanding bellies. She had taken this job when her brothers shipped overseas, part of the massive civilian mobilization that put women into roles previously held by men. The pay was good, but the work carried emotional weight. These men had been enemies. Now, she nourished them back to health. The irony wasn't lost on her. Her brothers fought Germans in Europe while she fed Germans in Texas. But Anna understood the larger purpose. Every meal served demonstrated American capacity in ways that pure military might could not. This was psychological warfare disguised as humanitarian obligation. Prisoners approached the serving line with anticipation that touched her heart. They had learned to trust the abundance, to expect portions that satisfied rather than merely sustained. Some gained 50 pounds within 6 months. Transformations that photographs documented with startling clarity. The menu rotated through foods most prisoners hadn't tasted in years. Fresh milk, real coffee, beef steaks, white bread with butter, vegetables that hadn't been preserved or pickled. Proteins arrived in quantities that German planners would have considered impossible to maintain. Anna watched prisoners write letters home, their faces troubled. How could they explain this abundance to families surviving on turnip soup and ersatz coffee? Some letters were censored, but whispers carried farther than ink. Word spread through Wehrmacht ranks that American captivity meant survival, even prosperity. The kitchen staff, mostly women from nearby towns, developed relationships with regular prisoners. Language barriers dissolved around shared meals. Some Germans helped with food preparation, teaching Anna recipes from their homeland, though ingredients here far exceeded what those recipes had originally required. Storage became a constant challenge. Food arrived faster than consumption could match. Warehouses filled with surplus that would have fed entire German towns. The waste shocked Anna initially, until she realized this was the point, abundance so complete that waste became possible. Her Catholic faith helped her process the moral complexity. These men had been enemies, but they were also someone's sons, husbands, fathers. Feeding them was both strategic necessity and human decency. Karl Weiss sat before a tray that challenged everything he thought he knew about warfare. Scrambled. Eggs, real eggs, not powder. Bacon thick enough to slice. White bread soft as cake. Butter that melted on contact. Coffee that smelled like heaven and tasted better than memory. For long moments, he simply stared. Surely this was a mistake meant for American officers rather than captured enemy soldiers. The MP who had escorted him to the mess hall showed no surprise, treating this abundance as routine rather than miraculous. Weiss touched the bacon first, marveling at the fat content. German rations eliminated fat whenever possible, preserving it for more critical uses. Here, fat was casually discarded, burned off in cooking, treated as expendable resource rather than precious commodity. The bread amazed him most. White flour, genuine wheat without sawdust, or potato starch extenders. He pressed it between his fingers, watching it spring back to shape. Such bread existed only in pre-war memories, yet here it was, served to prisoners as standard ration. Other. Captured Germans ate with reverence bordering on disbelief. Lieutenant Hermann Klein, captured near Caen, whispered that he had consumed more protein in this single meal than during his last month at the front. Corporal Franz Miller calculated calories aloud. This breakfast alone exceeded many full days. Rations in the Wehrmacht. The Americans watched their reactions with professional interest rather than malice. Guards discussed logistics in voices that carried clearly. Tomorrow's delivery would include fresh milk, beef for dinner, vegetables from California farms. The casual mention of such abundance seemed calculated to overwhelm rather than comfort. Weiss forced himself to eat slowly, savoring flavors that had become mythical. The eggs were creamy, the bacon crispy, the coffee rich without chicory bitterness. His stomach, accustomed to constant hunger, struggled with sudden plenty. Around him, conversations began in German as prisoners processed their situation. They were eating better than their own officers, better than their families, better than they had since childhood. The psychological impact was deliberate and devastating. Some prisoners couldn't finish their portions, a sight that would have caused Riots in German cities, food remained on plates, scraped into garbage bins, treated as waste rather than treasure. The demonstration of surplus was more powerful than any propaganda. Weiss understood the message. America possessed abundance so complete that even enemy prisoners ate like kings. This wasn't charity, but demonstration, proof that the Reich's promises of prosperity were lies, that true plenty existed beyond their borders. The meal ended with prisoners filing past waste bins filled with uneaten food. The sight would haunt Weiss for days, abundance so complete that surplus was discarded without thought, a luxury that his homeland could never comprehend. Colonel Robert Harding spread shipping manifests across his desk like a general studying battle maps. The numbers told a story more decisive than any military engagement. America produced half the world's corn, 2/3 of its oil, and shipped 16 million tons of food overseas annually. Feeding 370,000 German POWs represented less than 2% strain on national output. Harding had studied logistics at West Point, but civilian industrial capacity amazed him. Private contractors delivered supplies faster than military quartermasters could distribute them. Farms operated like factories, factories like farms, all coordinated through market mechanisms that no central planning could match. The mathematics fascinated him. Iowa alone produced enough corn to sustain multiple Army divisions indefinitely. Nebraska beef ranches could supply protein for entire prisoner populations without affecting civilian consumption. California vegetables filled freight cars daily, shipped east to camps where German prisoners ate fresh produce their own families hadn't seen in years. Refrigerated transport revolutionized military logistics. Before the war, armies marched on. Preserved foods, salt pork, hardtack, canned goods that lasted but satisfied little. Now Liberty ships carried fresh meat across oceans. Refrigerated rail cars delivered milk hundreds of miles, and prisoners ate steaks while their countrymen gnawed ersatz sausage. Harding calculated prisoner weight gains with scientific precision. Average increase, 45 to 55 pounds within 6 months. Total collective weight gain across all camps, millions of pounds. The transformation was measurable, photographable, undeniable proof of American productive supremacy. The contrast with Axis logistics was stark. German supply lines depended on horse-drawn wagons, often supplemented by forced labor and confiscated resources. Their soldiers foraged for food, while American POWs complained about repetitive menus featuring foods German civilians considered luxuries. Industrial democracy proved superior to totalitarian organization. Private companies competed for military contracts, driving innovation and efficiency. Farmers expanded production voluntarily, motivated by profit rather than coercion. The result was abundance that exceeded military requirements while maintaining civilian morale. Harding's reports reached Washington with recommendations that seemed impossible. Continue current feeding levels, document prisoner transformations, and use the evidence for psychological warfare. Well-fed prisoners became advertisements for American prosperity, living proof that cooperation produced better results than conquest. The Geneva Convention mandated equal treatment, but America exceeded requirements because it could afford generosity. This wasn't sacrifice, but demonstration, proof that democratic systems produced surplus sufficient to sustain both armies and enemies. Surplus became strategy. Every calorie fed to prisoners demonstrated capacity that Axis planners couldn't comprehend. Every pound gained by captive soldiers proved that American abundance was real, sustainable, and ultimately irresistible. The war would be won with weapons, but peace would be built on prosperity. Harding understood that feeding prisoners was investment in future stability, proof that former enemies could prosper under American influence. In dim barracks light, Karl Weiss wrote carefully on thin paper, knowing censors would read every word. His letter home began with required phrases. He was well, unharmed, treated according to international law. Then came the dangerous truth. We eat better here than at home. The censor's stamp would cover most details, but letters found ways to convey reality. Prisoners developed codes, subtle phrases that conveyed abundance without triggering complete censorship. The cooking reminds me of grandmother's Sunday dinners meant more food than German families saw in weeks. Ana Ramirez collected censored letters, reading fragments before incineration. Some passages escaped deletion. Descriptions of fresh milk, mentions of meat at every meal, casual references to discarded food. These fragments, reaching German families, caused more damage than bombers. Gestapo reports documented civilian morale collapse as letters describing prisoner conditions reached home. Families surviving on turnip soup and sawdust bread couldn't comprehend their captured sons eating steaks daily. Resentment grew, not toward Americans, but toward a regime that had promised prosperity while delivering starvation. Wehrmacht intelligence intercepted similar reports from other camps. American abundance was systematic, not isolated charity. Every prison facility fed captured Germans better than the Reich fed its own people. The psychological warfare was deliberate and devastating. Weiss struggled with guilt as he wrote. How could he describe butter on fresh bread to his wife, who hadn't seen real butter in months? How could he mention discarded food to children growing thin despite their mother's efforts? Yet silence felt like betrayal of a different kind. Some prisoners requested transfers to European camps, unable to bear the psychological weight of abundance while their families starved. Others embraced the plenty, gaining weight rapidly, and writing grateful letters that censors allowed through unchanged. These letters, reaching German lines, encouraged surrender rates that alarmed Wehrmacht command. The Whisper Network proved unstoppable. Prisoners transferred between camps carried stories of American abundance. Repatriated wounded described conditions that seemed impossible to believe. Even censored communications conveyed the essential truth. America possessed surplus beyond German imagination. Families began writing different letters to captured relatives, letters that revealed domestic conditions through careful omission. No mention of adequate meals implied their absence. Descriptions of managing with available resources suggested scarcity that contrasted sharply with prisoner abundance. Anna observed the emotional toll on prisoners who received such letters. Some ate less, unable to enjoy abundance while families suffered. Others ate more desperately, uncertain when such plenty might end. The psychological complexity of feeding enemies while their families starved created moral burdens no training had prepared anyone to handle. The letters became intelligence gold mines, revealing German domestic conditions more accurately than any espionage network could achieve. On foggy French roads, German soldiers lowered their rifles at the first sight of American uniforms, whispering phrases that had spread through Wehrmacht ranks. America, gut Essen. Surrender had become tactical calculation rather than last resort. Jack Mallory witnessed this phenomenon repeatedly during the final months of war. German resistance collapsed not just from military pressure, but from knowledge that American captivity meant survival. Word had spread through enemy lines that capture by Americans offered better prospects than fighting for the Reich. The transformation was measurable. Intelligence reports documented surrender rates increasing dramatically when German units faced American rather than Soviet forces. Prisoners specifically requested transfer to American custody, understanding that abundance awaited behind American wire. Hershey bars became negotiating tools more effective than interrogation techniques. American soldiers traded chocolate for information, coffee for cooperation, cigarettes for intelligence that revealed German positions and intentions. Hunger had become weapon as powerful as artillery. Jack observed the psychology of surrender during processing operations. German soldiers arrived defeated but wary, expecting harsh treatment based on their own military traditions. The first meal changed everything, abundance that exceeded their officers' rations, food served without humiliation or deprivation. Processed prisoners became unwitting recruiters for American custody. Transfer between camps or medical facilities allowed them to share information about conditions that seemed too good to believe. Stories spread faster than official communications, reaching German lines through networks that military intelligence couldn't intercept. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The strategic implications were enormous. Every German soldier who surrendered, expecting good treatment, was one less defender of Hitler's regime. American abundance had become recruitment tool for ending the war, encouraging defection through promise of survival rather than death. Field commanders reported unusual German behavior during final engagements. Enemy soldiers fought defensively rather than aggressively, seeking to be captured rather than killed. Some units surrendered en masse when surrounded, preferring American custody to hopeless resistance. Jack's Midwestern background helped him understand the psychological warfare. Abundance was foreign concept to soldiers raised in scarcity, educated in theories that portrayed struggle as natural condition. Demonstrating plenty challenged their fundamental worldview more effectively than political propaganda. The smell of American field kitchens became psychological weapon. Aromas of real coffee, frying bacon, and fresh bread carried across battle lines, advertising abundance that made German rations seem even more inadequate by comparison. Hunger demoralized more efficiently than fear. Surrender ceremonies became demonstrations of plenty. Captured Germans received immediate medical attention, hot meals, and treatment that exceeded Geneva Convention requirements. The contrast with their own military's harsh discipline was stark and deliberate. Jack realized that America's secret weapon wasn't just the M1 Garand or Sherman tank, it was the cafeteria line that promised abundance to anyone who laid down arms. Refrigerated. Train cars rolled across the American heartland like a mechanical parade of plenty, carrying fresh beef from Kansas ranches, dairy products from Wisconsin farms, and produce from California valleys. The trains arrived daily at POW camps, their cargo representing industrial agriculture, operating at scales that German planners couldn't comprehend. Ana Ramirez watched the unloading process with amazement that never faded. Sides of beef arrived frozen solid, requiring industrial equipment to process. Milk arrived in quantities that exceeded many towns' daily consumption. Vegetables came packed in ice, fresh enough that some still carried soil from distant farms. The logistical achievement surpassed military operations in complexity and scale. Coordinating food delivery for 370,000 prisoners required railway scheduling, refrigerated transport, and distribution networks that operated with clockwork precision. Private companies bid competitively for contracts, driving efficiency that government planning could never achieve. Colonel Harding documented the system's capacity in reports that read like industrial poetry. American farms produced surplus, so vast that feeding prisoners represented negligible drain on national resources. Canneries operated around the clock, producing 1.6 billion cans annually, enough to feed armies while maintaining civilian abundance. POWs gained weight so rapidly that uniforms required constant replacement. Average weight increase reached 45 to 55 pounds within 6 months of capture. Collective weight gain across all camps totaled millions of pounds, a statistic that measured victory in flesh rather than territory. The mechanization amazed European observers who visited camps. Combine harvesters cut grain in hours that German farmers required weeks to gather by hand. Tractors pulled implements that multiplied individual productivity beyond traditional agricultural calculations. The contrast illustrated why America could afford abundance while the Reich struggled with scarcity. Liberty ships extended America's agricultural reach across oceans, carrying surplus to allies while maintaining prisoner populations. Refrigeration technology, developed for civilian markets, revolutionized military logistics. Fresh food traveled thousands of miles, arriving in condition that exceeded local availability in many destinations. German agricultural experts, captured during the retreat from France, studied American methods with professional interest that bordered on despair. Their reports described farming techniques that seemed almost supernatural: mechanical precision, chemical fertilizers, hybrid seeds that produced yields exceeding European imagination. The prisoners themselves became living advertisements for American abundance. Photographs documented their transformation from skeletal figures to healthy men whose weight exceeded pre-war levels. The visual evidence was more powerful than any propaganda campaign. Anna observed that even kitchen waste from POW camps exceeded many German families' weekly rations. Food scraps were composted or fed to livestock. Waste that would have caused riots in Berlin treated as routine byproduct of abundance. The system operated so efficiently that surplus became standard rather than exception. Colonel Harding toured a Midwest cannery where tin cans rolled off production lines like artillery, shells from an ammunition plant. The machinery operated with mechanical rhythm that produced 1.6 billion cans annually, enough to feed not just American forces, but captured enemies across multiple continents. The factory floor stretched beyond visible horizon, automated systems, performing tasks that required hundreds of workers in European facilities. Steam-powered equipment, electrical lighting, and conveyor belts created production capacity that exceeded entire German industrial sectors. This single facility could supply more canned goods than the Reich produced nationally. Harding calculated production figures that seemed fictional. American agriculture outproduced German farming by ratios that made competition impossible. Iowa corn harvests exceeded total German grain production. Nebraska beef production supplied more protein than the entire Wehrmacht received annually. California produce filled freight cars daily, shipped to camps where prisoners ate fresh vegetables their families hadn't seen in years. The mathematics of abundance were overwhelming. Liberty ships carried 16 million tons of food overseas annually while maintaining domestic surplus. Truck convoys delivered supplies faster than German horse-drawn. Logistics could distribute basic rations. Refrigerated transport preserved quality across distances that would have spoiled food under traditional methods. German industrial experts, when shown these facilities, experienced cognitive dissonance that bordered on breakdown. Their own war production sacrificed civilian goods for military necessity, while American industry expanded both sectors simultaneously. The productive capacity seemed almost supernatural. Harding understood that feeding prisoners was demonstration rather than burden. Every calorie delivered to camps proved that American abundance was real, sustainable, and ultimately irresistible. The psychological warfare was more devastating than bombing campaigns. Production statistics revealed why German victory was mathematically impossible. While Wehrmacht planners calculated resource allocation down to individual bullets, American industry produced surplus that allowed waste. The contrast illustrated fundamental differences between totalitarian scarcity and democratic abundance. Prisoners gained weight because America could afford generosity without sacrificing military effectiveness. The same productive capacity that supplied armies also sustained enemies, demonstrating surplus that challenged everything German soldiers believed about industrial warfare. Factory automation eliminated labor shortages that plagued German production. Machines worked continuously, unaffected by bombing raids or conscription demands. The technological advantage multiplied human productivity beyond traditional calculations. What the Wehrmacht saw as impossible waste, Harding recognized as strategic demonstration. Every discarded meal in prisoner camps proved that American abundance exceeded German comprehension. The psychological impact was more decisive than battlefield victories. The cannery represented America's true secret weapon, productive capacity, so vast that feeding enemies became advertisement for democratic prosperity rather than burden on military resources. Harding's final report landed on Washington desks like a mathematical explosion. German POWs in American custody had collectively gained millions of pounds during their captivity. The statistic reframed the entire war, victory measured not just in territory captured or enemies killed, but in bodies restored to health through systematic abundance. The numbers challenged traditional military accounting. Feeding 370,000 prisoners had required enormous resources, yet represented less than 2% strain on American production capacity. The surplus demonstrated industrial might more effectively than any weapons display. Photographic evidence documented transformations that seemed impossible. Skeletal figures from early capture photos became healthy men whose weight exceeded pre-war levels. The visual evidence was undeniable. American abundance had literally reshaped enemy soldiers into advertisements for democratic prosperity. Harding's mathematical analysis revealed the true scale of victory. While German civilians survived on 1,200 calories daily, American POWs consumed triple that amount. The contrast illustrated why totalitarian systems could never compete with democratic abundance. Intelligence reports confirmed the psychological impact across German lines. Surrender rates increased dramatically as knowledge of American prison. Conditions spread through Wehrmacht ranks. Soldiers preferred capture to hopeless resistance, calculating that American custody offered better survival prospects than fighting for the Reich. The repatriation process would send these well-fed prisoners home to a Germany devastated by bombing and starvation. Their healthy appearance would contrast sharply with civilian suffering, demonstrating American capacity in ways that pure military might could never achieve. Harding understood the long-term implications. These prisoners would return home as living testimony to American abundance, carrying memories of plenty that would reshape German understanding of democratic systems. The psychological impact would outlast military occupation. The statistical monument was complete. Millions of pounds gained, thousands of lives saved, and one more proof that American victory was inevitable. The numbers told a story more decisive than any battle. Abundance had triumphed over scarcity, democracy over totalitarianism. Production figures supported Harding's conclusions. American farms continued expanding output while feeding prisoners, proving that generosity didn't require sacrifice. The productive capacity seemed unlimited, constrained only by distribution rather than supply. History would record victories in battles won and territories captured, but Harding knew the deeper truth. America had defeated its enemies not just through superior firepower, but through abundance so complete that even captive enemies prospered under democratic plenty. The war was ending, but the demonstration would continue. Every well-fed prisoner returning to devastated Germany would carry proof that American promises of prosperity were real, achievable, and ultimately irresistible. In 1946, Karl Weiss stepped off a repatriation train in Leipzig, 55 pounds heavier than when he was captured in Normandy. His family waited on the platform, gaunt figures whose hollow eyes reflected years of hunger, rationing, and systematic deprivation under the collapsing Reich. The reunion was awkward, weighted with unspoken contrasts. Weiss's mother touched his filled cheeks with trembling fingers, unable to comprehend how captivity had nourished while freedom had starved. His wife counted pounds that her family had lost while he gained weight behind American wire. Weiss struggled to explain the abundance he had experienced. How could he describe fresh milk to people who hadn't tasted dairy in months? How could he mention discarded food to children who counted crumbs? The words seemed like fantasies, stories too incredible for German reality, yet the evidence was undeniable. Photographs showed his transformation from skeletal soldier to healthy man. Medical records documented weight gain that exceeded pre-war levels. The visual proof challenged everything his family understood about warfare and captivity. Neighbors gathered to hear his stories, hungry for news from the outside world. Weiss described meals that seemed like fairy tales: beefsteaks, white bread, butter, fresh vegetables, real coffee. The abundance sounded impossible to people who had survived on turnip soup and ersatz substitutes. The psychological impact spread through communities as other prisoners returned with similar stories. American captivity had been paradise compared to German civilian life. The contrast demoralized more effectively than military defeat, proving that enemy promises of prosperity were real, while Nazi pledges had been lies. Weiss carried guilt along with his weight. He had prospered while his family suffered, eaten abundance while his community starved. Yet he also carried proof that different systems produced different results. Abundance was possible under democratic governance. His stories influenced locals' attitudes toward American occupation forces. Instead of conquerors to be feared, Americans became representatives of the abundance that prisoners had experienced. The psychological preparation was complete. Occupation became liberation for people who had learned to associate America with plenty. Weiss never forgot the taste of American abundance. In later years, as Germany rebuilt under democratic systems, he would point to agricultural abundance and an industrial prosperity as proof that the prisoners' stories had been true. America had demonstrated what was possible when freedom and productivity combined. The weight he carried home was more than flesh. It was proof that another world existed where abundance was normal rather than impossible. That proof would reshape German understanding of what democratic systems could achieve when properly organized and freely operated. His transformation became part of family history, passed down to children who would grow up in prosperity rather than scarcity. Years later, Jack Mallory walked across empty Nebraska fields where the POW camp once stood. Concrete foundations remained, overgrown with prairie grass, but the barracks were gone. He brought his grandchildren here to tell them about the war that was fought with bread as much as bullets. "We defeated them with abundance," he explained, watching their young faces try to comprehend conflict through plenty rather than violence. The concept challenged their understanding of warfare just as it had challenged his during those months as a prison guard. Jack remembered the transformations he had witnessed, skeletal prisoners becoming healthy men within months of American captivity. The visual evidence had been undeniable. Democracy produced abundance that totalitarian systems could never match. Anna Ramirez, now elderly but still sharp, joined these visits when her health permitted. She would describe the industrial kitchens, the massive vats of stew, the surplus that overwhelmed storage facilities. Her memories complemented Jack's, painting complete pictures of abundance as warfare. Together they explained how feeding prisoners had been strategy rather than charity. Every calorie delivered demonstrated American capacity. Every pound gained by captive soldiers proved democratic prosperity was real. The psychological impact had been more decisive than military campaigns. The grandchildren asked practical questions. How much food? How many prisoners? How fast did they gain weight? The statistics still amazed Jack. 45 to 55 pounds average weight gain, millions of pounds collectively, transformation documented in photographs that seemed impossible to believe. Jack's agricultural background helped him explain the underlying systems. American farms had produced surplus sufficient to feed armies and enemies simultaneously. The productive capacity had seemed unlimited, constrained only by distribution rather than supply. The long-term implications were becoming clear as Jack aged. Germany had rebuilt under democratic systems, achieving prosperity that validated every prisoner's story about American abundance. The psychological preparation had been complete. Former enemies had become allies through demonstrated plenty. Jack understood that he had witnessed something historically unique: warfare through generosity, victory through abundance, psychological defeat through systematic plenty. The prisoners had returned home carrying proof that democratic systems produced results that totalitarian regimes could never achieve. Anna added her perspective about the human cost of abundance. Feeding enemies while their families starved had created moral complexities that no training had addressed. Yet the strategic necessity was clear. Demonstration of plenty had been more persuasive than propaganda. The war had been won not only in blood and steel, but in the simple fact that even prisoners left America stronger than they arrived. That victory resonated across decades, shaping international relations through memories of abundance shared even with enemies. The story of German POWs in America did not end when the barbed wire fences came down. The weight they carried home, literal and symbolic, outlasted the war itself, becoming a kind of living archive of what abundance could achieve when weaponized. In 1946, ships and trains bore hundreds of thousands of former enemies back across the Atlantic. They stepped off at ruined stations in Frankfurt, Munich, Leipzig, and Dresden, not as the hollow men they had been when captured, but as visibly healthier, heavier, and often bewildered figures. The civilians who met them had survived on meager rations, turnip soup, ersatz bread, acorn coffee. To see returning soldiers with filled cheeks, glossy hair, and bodies 50 pounds heavier was to confront a reality that shattered whatever fragments of Nazi propaganda still lingered. For those prisoners, explaining their condition was nearly impossible. They stumbled over words when wives asked how they had eaten, when children asked why their father looked well-fed while their ribs protruded. The answers sounded like fables: real milk every day, steaks on Sundays, white bread soft as pillows, coffee rich enough to perfume entire barracks. In communities where hunger defined existence, these stories spread like sparks in tinder, and with them spread a dangerous truth that democracy had proven its superiority not only on the battlefield but on the dinner table. Historians often measure wars in bodies lost, towns destroyed, treaties signed. Yet the return of these POWs forced scholars to reckon with something less tangible, but no less powerful: the politics of the stomach. Families saw with their own eyes that a nation could feed even its enemies better than the Reich had fed its own children. Gestapo reports from the war years had already hinted at the corrosive effect of prisoner letters. Now, with the men themselves back, those hints solidified into conviction. Civilians whispered, "If America can afford to fatten our captives, what else could life be under such a system?" This realization did not instantly transform Germany into a democracy, but it primed the soil. When the Marshall Plan arrived with shipments of flour, butter, and powdered milk, Germans did not scoff at the promise. They had already seen through their own sons and fathers that American abundance was real. The memories of captivity became proof, carried in flesh. Yet abundance left scars too. Many POWs wrestled with guilt for decades. They had gained weight while their families shrank. They had eaten butter while wives scrounged potato peels. They had written letters describing food they could not, in good conscience, mention aloud once home. Some never spoke of it. Others over-explained, trying to convince neighbors that the meals were not indulgence, but evidence of something larger, that they had been unwilling participants in a demonstration of plenty. Still, resentment brewed in corners of bombed-out cities. Why had enemies fed their husbands so well while they starved? Why had Allied resources gone to prisoners rather than civilians? This tension gave rise to what scholars later called the paradox of abundance, the very strategy that eroded Nazi. Morale and hastened surrender also created awkward silences in post-war Germany. Abundance became a dividing line, not just between America and Germany, but within German families themselves. But time reshaped bitterness into pragmatism. As West Germany began its economic miracle in the 1950s, many former POWs pointed to their captivity as a strange kind of preparation. They had witnessed large-scale mechanized farming, industrial canning, refrigerated logistics. They had lived inside the system of surplus. When German agriculture and industry were rebuilt with American assistance, these men carried with them not just memories of taste, but lessons of production. A farmer who had peeled potatoes in a Texas mess hall remembered the size of Iowa corn harvests and pushed for hybrid seed adoption back home. An engineer who had unloaded refrigerated freight in Kansas argued for cold chain infrastructure in post-war Hamburg. Even cooks who had ladled beef stew in Nebraska brought back practices of scale, efficiency, and mechanization. In this way, the feeding of prisoners became more than a wartime weapon. It became an inadvertent transfer of knowledge. Abundance, once a shock, turned into blueprint. Back in the United States, memories of the POW camps also lingered, though in quieter ways. Farmers in Kansas, Nebraska, and Texas told stories of trains unloading beef not just for soldiers, but for enemies. Guards like Jack Mallory carried into old age the knowledge that victory had been measured not just in combat, but in calories. For many civilians, there was moral unease. Housewives rationed sugar, while German prisoners licked butter off their knives. Families stretched bacon grease into soup, while POWs sometimes left meat unfinished. This contrast bred resentment in some quarters. Letters to local newspapers questioned why enemies ate so well, while loyal citizens made do with less. Yet, in retrospect, historians see this policy as one of America's most effective weapons. Feeding prisoners generously cost little relative to total output. It showcased the ability of a free market democracy to produce surplus even in wartime, and it undermined enemy morale in ways bombs never could. By the 1970s, when former guards and cooks like Jack and Anna Ramirez told their grandchildren about the camps, the narrative had softened into something almost unbelievable. Children laughed at the idea of Germans gaining weight behind barbed wire. To them, war meant deprivation, not abundance. Yet the photographs, still kept in attics and archives, told the truth. Scarecrows transformed into well-fed men. For the Germans, too, these stories became family lore. Many who had returned heavy from America found themselves telling grandchildren about the land of plenty, where even prisoners ate like kings. These tales became part of a broader German memory of the war, not just of destruction and guilt, but of the strange irony that captivity had sometimes meant survival. The weight gained in POW camps carried political weight as well. When post-war alliances solidified, when West Germany joined NATO, when Cold War lines hardened, the memory of American abundance played a subtle role. Germans who had been prisoners knew firsthand that America's promises of prosperity were not empty. They had eaten them pound by pound in bacon and bread and milk. This did not erase the trauma of war, nor the crimes committed under Hitler's regime. But it created a bridge. Former enemies could become allies not through abstract ideals, but through lived proof of what democratic abundance meant. The Soviet Union, by contrast, returned German prisoners years later, starved and broken. their bodies bearing witness to scarcity and repression. The contrast was stark, and it mattered. When Germans weighed the futures offered by East and West, memories of captivity tipped the scale. Wars are usually tallied in dead and wounded, in territory gained or lost. Yet the story of German POWs in America reminds us that victory can also be measured in something as humble as body weight. The 50 pounds gained by Karl Weiss were more than flesh. They were testimony. They were a living demonstration that democracy could feed both friend and foe, that abundance itself could become a weapon of persuasion. In Leipzig, Weiss would sometimes look at photographs of his younger self, gaunt and starving in Normandy, then compare them to the robust figure who had returned from Texas. He carried that contrast all his life, a reminder that the world could be different than the one promised by Nazi slogans. In Nebraska, Jack Mallory would point to the empty fields where the camp once stood and tell his grandchildren, "We won because we could feed even our enemies better than they fed themselves." And in kitchens across America, women like Anna Ramirez would remember stirring vats of stew for men who, only months earlier, had fought against their brothers. She would recall the paradox of feeding enemies while neighbors rationed, but also the quiet knowledge that every ladle of abundance was part of victory. By the end of their lives, many of those who had lived this story came to the same conclusion. The most devastating psychological weapon of the war was not the bomb or the tank, but the cafeteria line. The war had been won not just with bullets and steel, but with butter and bread. The true epilogue, then, is not just about German POWs putting on 50 pounds in captivity. It is about how those pounds became symbols of American industrial power, of democratic prosperity, of the human capacity to use even generosity as strategy. The weight gained in those camps outlasted the war. It lived on in memories, in stories told children, in the agricultural and industrial practices carried back to Europe. It became part of the fabric of the Cold War, part of the Reconstruction of Germany, part of the larger narrative of how abundance can shape history. In the end, the most enduring lesson was simple. Scarcity breaks, but abundance persuades. America had proved that a meal could be as mighty as a weapon, and that sometimes the path to victory runs not through destruction, but through the simple, devastating power of feeding even your enemies until they can no longer believe in the world they left behind. If you enjoyed this story, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.